not a conversation that I would necessarily have. I think it's perfectly true that it is a moment where you need to have that discussion. But I would just underline that the monarchy provides, with the Constitution, a degree of long-term.
When the envelope arrived at Princess Anne's private residence, it carried no crest, no ceremony, just 3 words written in Prince William's unmistakable hand. "Please come alone." She almost didn't go until she saw the date. It wasn't an anniversary she celebrated, nor one the palace marked in its meticulous calendar. But to Anne, it was a wound that had never truly closed the date Diana had died. Her fingers lingered on the paper longer than she intended, as if the ink itself might explain the uncharacteristic directness. William had never written to her this way before. No royal stationery, no formality, just an unvarnished plea. It was entirely out of the usual channels, and that alone told Anne more than words could. This wasn't about duty or ceremony. This was about something raw, something personal. She read the note again, then once more, a habit she had when something unsettled her. The handwriting was steady, but there was an urgency beneath the surface, a quiet insistence that she could almost hear in his voice. The absence of explanation was deliberate, almost as if too much said on paper might dilute the gravity of the request. Anne's mind turned over the possibilities of health matters, family rifts, political storms. But deep down, something colder twisted in her chest. She knew this wasn't any of those things. This was about the past, and the past had a way of finding its way back into the room no matter how firmly you bolted the door. Since Diana's death, Anne had built an unspoken pact with herself. No indulgence in sentiment. She had been there for the formalities, the funeral, the tributes, the moments the cameras demanded, but privately, she had kept her grief contained, sealed away with all the other emotions she deemed a liability. She told herself it was discipline. Others whispered it was distant. Either way, she had survived by never lingering too long in the shadow of that summer in 1997. Yet William's note cracked that discipline in an instant. The simplicity of it, the strange directness, felt like the start of something she could neither predict nor control. And for a woman who prided herself on being in control, that was perhaps the most dangerous thing of all. She thought briefly of Diana herself, how often she had seen her sister-in-law walk into rooms with that disarming blend of grace and defiance. They had never been close, never shared in the way the public liked to imagine royal women did. But there was something about Diana's presence, about the way she left an imprint that refused to fade. The phrasing of William's note kept replaying in her mind. "Please come alone." Why would he need to say that unless the matter was so sensitive, so volatile, that even the echo of palace gossip could destroy it? And why now? Why, after decades of silence, did she feel the pull of a moment she thought had been buried with Diana herself? A creeping sensation whispered that what awaited her was not a conversation. It was a burden, one William could not carry by himself. Her curiosity wrestled with a familiar instinct to walk away, to preserve the careful walls she had spent years building. But there was also something else, a quieter, more stubborn voice that told her this was not about her. Whatever this was, it was William's way of placing something in her hands. Perhaps something meant for her all along, and if she turned away now, she might never learn what that was. And so, with the weight of curiosity and something darker pressing at her chest, Anne stepped into the one room she had sworn never to enter again, Diana's study. The door creaked open, and it was as if the summer of 1997 had been locked inside, untouched. A faint trace of Diana's perfume still lingered, weaving its way through the stillness like a ghost refusing to leave. For nearly 3 decades, Princess Anne had managed to avoid this space, telling herself there was no need, no reason, no point in revisiting what could not be undone. Yet here she was drawn, not by her own will, but by William's quiet summons, a summons she could neither question nor refuse. Every step deeper into the room felt like trespassing, as if crossing into a place that was never meant to be disturbed. It wasn't the grandeur or the elegance that struck her. It was the absence of time. The photographs still sat neatly in their frames, some showing Diana's radiant smile beside her son's, others capturing moments of solitary grace. A vase of silk flowers stood perfectly arranged, their colors frozen in a false bloom that neither faded nor grew. Shelves lined with pale blue and navy-bound books gathered not dust, but silence. The kind of silence that carries weight, that demands to be respected. Anne's eyes swept the room, careful not to linger too long on any one memory. She and Diana had never been the kind to share easy laughter or quiet confidences. Their worlds, though under the same roof, had spun in different orbits. Anne's anchored in discipline, Diana's in emotional connection. And yet, standing here now, that distance felt blurred, replaced by an intimacy that neither of them would have admitted to in life. William stood to the side, his expression guarded but expectant. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes shifted toward a small, velvet-covered box resting on the desk. It was placed, not carelessly, but deliberately, as if it had been waiting. Anne hesitated. A jewelry box was, in theory, an unremarkable thing in a royal household, where diamonds and sapphires were as common as family heirlooms. Yet, something in the way it sat centered, untouched, made her pulse slow, her thoughts tighten. She approached it slowly, her fingers brushing the velvet as if gauging its temperature. For a moment, she considered leaving it closed, preserving whatever secret it held, because once opened, there would be no undoing it. But that same voice that had pushed her to step into this room now urged her to see it through. She lifted the lid, expecting perhaps a brooch she had seen Diana wear at state functions, or a strand of pearls with more sentimental than financial value. But what lay inside stopped her breath, mid-draw. The soft lining cradled a single familiar jewel, a sapphire brooch, deep blue encircled by diamonds, one she recalled from a banquet decades earlier. But the brooch was not what made her hand tremble. It was the small, folded scrap of paper taped beneath the lining, its edges yellowed with time, her own name written in Diana's unmistakable hand. Her chest tightened. This was no ornament. This was deliberate. This was personal. And there, nestled beneath sapphire velvet, lay not just a jewel, but a message meant for Anne alone. It wasn't the sapphire brooch that made her breath hitch. It was the folded scrap of paper taped beneath it, Diana's handwriting, and her name. The jewel itself was a masterpiece, deep blue wrapped in a halo of flawless diamonds, the kind of piece that radiated both elegance and authority. Anne recognized it instantly, not just for its beauty, but for its history. It had been a gift from the Queen to Diana in 1983, a diplomatic gesture wrapped in royal tradition. She remembered the first time she'd seen it worn, gleaming under the chandeliers at a state banquet. That night had been a performance, every smile rehearsed, every step choreographed. And yet, Diana had walked in wearing that brooch like a declaration. Not ostentatious, not subservient, just unshakably her. Anne had noticed it then, though she never said it aloud. The subtle way Diana used grace as armor. The tilt of her chin, the calm defiance in her eyes, the way she could make a room bend toward her without demanding it. That brooch had been more than an accessory. It had been a shield. And now, decades later, it sat before her, not on a gown in a grand hall, but in a box, tethered to a secret. Her eyes locked on the paper, the edges curled and delicate with age. She eased it free, unfolding it as if it might crumble in her hands. The words leapt out immediately. If Anne ever sees this, I hope she understands why I chose kindness. The handwriting was unmistakably elegant, yet hurried, as if the writer knew time was short. The sentence struck Anne with the force of something she hadn't prepared herself to feel. Kindness. The word itself was both a confession and a challenge. She felt a tightening in her chest. For years, she had regarded Diana's openness with a kind of restrained skepticism. To Anne, duty meant control. Emotion was a luxury, and in the palace, luxuries were dangerous. Diana's way of bearing her heart in public had often seemed reckless, even self-destructive. But here, in this quiet moment, Anne was faced with a truth she had never considered. Diana's warmth hadn't been a weakness. It had been a choice, a deliberate act in a world that thrived on cold calculation. The idea that Diana had singled her out was just as jarring. Of all the people in the royal circle, why leave this to her? Why trust that she would one day understand? The thought unsettled her, because it meant Diana had seen something in her capacity for empathy she rarely admitted to herself, let alone to others. Anne's gaze drifted back to the brooch, the same jewel she had once viewed as a symbol of status. Now, it felt like a key, unlocking something far more dangerous than royal protocol would ever allow. As she turned the paper over in her hand, a faint smudge caught her attention, faded and almost lost to time. Leaning closer, she saw there were more words, half hidden in the fold, as though meant only for the eyes of someone willing to look beyond the obvious. Her fingers trembled as she read the final line, a plea that shattered every barrier she had built around Diana's memory. Beneath the polite grace of the note lay 6 words that would not leave her. "Don't let it take my boys." They stared back at Anne like a warning, etched in stone, meant not for the public, not for history books, but for her eyes alone. This was no flowery farewell, no soft confession. It was a plea stripped bare. In those words, Anne heard none of the rivalry or distance that had defined their relationship in life. This was Diana, speaking past the years of icy exchanges and clipped politeness, reaching for the one person she believed could stand against the slow, grinding machinery of the crown. Anne felt an unease settle into her chest. She had been entrusted not with sentiment, but with responsibility. Why her? Why not Sarah Ferguson, who had shared whispered laughter and conspiratorial glances with Diana? Why not one of the friends who had been there in her darkest hours? The answer was as sharp as it was uncomfortable. Anne had never played the courtier, never bent her principles to suit the palace's narratives. She had stood apart from the gossip, the manipulations, the ever-turning wheels of favor and resentment. Diana must have known that if this note survived the years, Anne would not dismiss it as emotional indulgence. She would see it for what it was, a call to act. As Anne sat with the note, fragments of the past intruded. She remembered the whispers in Diana's final months, the way her life seemed to hum with a strange, urgent energy, as though she were racing against something unseen. The public had been enthralled by the glamour, the high-profile causes, the new romance, but inside palace walls, the air was thick with unease. Diana had confided to a few trusted aides that she felt watched, followed, even hunted. And there had been that one chilling letter, penned to her butler, forewarning of a planned accident in her car. At the time, many dismissed it as paranoia. Now, holding this message, Anne wondered if those fears had been part of a much larger truth Diana had been trying to protect her children from. The phrasing was deliberate. Diana hadn't written, "Don't let them hurt my boys." She'd written, "Don't let it take my boys." Not a person, not a scandal. It, the crown, the institution itself, the gilded cage that gave with one hand and took with the other. Diana had fought it in her own way by choosing openness, compassion, and visibility, in a family that preferred shadows, but she had also learned, perhaps too late, how relentless it could be in bending people to its will. Anne's throat tightened. This was no posthumous cry for comfort. It was strategy. Diana had chosen her words with precision, knowing they might one day reach someone willing to act when others would stay silent. And now, that burden had landed squarely in Anne's hands. She understood the cost of ignoring it. She had seen what happened when the palace machine decided what was best for its heirs, regardless of their hearts or their humanity. If the crown had claimed Diana, it could just as easily claim William and Harry, shaping them into something they were never meant to be. And in that moment, Anne knew she couldn't leave the past where it was. This had to be faced, and it had to be now. She thought she had seen everything, until her fingertips found the faintest click beneath the box's lower lining. The sound was almost imperceptible, yet it carried the weight of something deliberate, something hidden with purpose. Anne froze, her pulse slowing as her hand hovered over the base of the jewelry box. This was no ordinary storage. This was a secret. She slid her nails along the seam, and with the gentlest pressure, a narrow panel shifted open, revealing a compartment no larger than a book. For a moment, she simply stared at it, the air around her heavy with the awareness that whatever lay inside had been kept from every eye for decades, until now. Inside, the first thing she saw was not a jewel, but paper folded, yellowed, fragile at the edges. She lifted the bundle carefully, the scent of age clinging to it. As she unfolded the top sheet, her breath caught. They were sketches, rough yet detailed, each depicting a piece of jewelry, necklaces, brooches, rings. But alongside each drawing were Diana's unmistakable notes in looping, elegant script. For cancer wards, one read, "Proceeds to Great Ormond Street," said another. These were not designs for personal adornment. They were blueprints for a vision of jewels that would serve the vulnerable treasures transformed into acts of healing. It was Diana's compassion made tangible. the kind of project she had never shared with the press, perhaps fearing the Crown's disapproval of something so personal, so untraditional. Anne turned the pages slowly, each note revealing another layer of the woman she thought she had known but never fully understood. Beneath the sketches was a single photograph. She knew the setting instantly at a garden party in the summer of 1992. In the image, Diana stood between Anne and the Queen, all three caught mid-laughter. There was nothing formal about it, no stiff posture, no carefully arranged smiles. It was genuine, unguarded, and on the back, in Diana's graceful handwriting, were words that struck Anne harder than she expected. "We weren't close, but we were family." Her throat tightened as she traced the ink with her thumb. Diana had seen her as more than a critic. Beneath the layers of reserve and unspoken judgment, she had recognized Anne as someone who, in her own way, could protect what mattered most. It was an acknowledgement Anne had never sought, yet now, it felt like both a gift and a challenge. She could feel the burn rising behind her eyes, but she refused to let the tears fall. Not here, not now. The box clicked shut in her hands, its secrets now hers to bear. Yet the photograph remained pressed against her palm, warm, despite the chill of the room. Anne knew that while paper fades and ink can blur, the truth they held was too sharp to be ignored. Diana's vision had been hidden, her trust placed in silence. And now that silence had been broken, but photographs fade. The truth they hold demands to be acted upon. Anne walked into Clarence's house without an appointment, brooch in one hand, letter in the other. Charles looked up from behind his desk, and for a moment, his face drained of color. It was not the jewel that caught him off guard. It was the paper beside it, folded, aged, and unmistakably marked by Diana's hand. He didn't ask where she had found it. He didn't need to. The air between them tightened, years of silence compressing into a single instant. Anne's tone was steady, but her eyes held the weight of something unshakable. She had not come for the ceremony, nor to reminisce about the truth. Without a word, she placed the items before him and stepped back, giving him space to face what he had avoided for so long. Charles hesitated before reaching for the letter, his fingers brushing the edges as though it might burn him. The sight of Diana's handwriting froze him in place, the loops and flourishes so familiar, so alive, they seemed to defy the decades since she had gone. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. Then, slowly, he unfolded the paper and began to read. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. First, a flicker of confusion, then something heavier, darker. By the time his eyes reached the final lines, his lips were pressed into a thin, unsteady line. He read it again, slower this time, as though searching for a different meaning, one that might make the ache in his chest easier to bear. When he finally looked up, there was no defensiveness, no royal distance, just a quiet strain that betrayed the depth of what the words had stirred. "She left you that?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Anne held his gaze. "She feared the machine would break her sons," she said simply. It nearly did. The bluntness of her words cut through the room. They both knew what she meant, not just the public storms, but the private ones, the pressures that had already driven deep fractures into the family, some of which would never heal. It was the first real conversation they had had about Diana since 1997. For years, they had both kept her name wrapped in the protective armor of formality, mentioning her only when protocol required. Now, the formality is gone. There was no performance here, only two siblings bound by the same history, standing on opposite sides of a truth neither could ignore any longer. Charles looked down again at the letter, his thumb tracing the edge as though afraid to put it away. "We all thought we had time," he murmured, almost to himself. Anne didn't reply to that. Time was not something they could reclaim, but real change might still be possible. She leaned forward, her voice calm but resolute, telling him plainly that things could not go on as they had. Not for William, not for Harry, not for the monarchy's future. It wasn't a plea, it was a warning. For the first time, Charles didn't argue. He didn't deflect. He simply nodded, a subtle but telling sign that something in him had shifted. But Anne's mission wasn't complete until the letter reached the person Diana had written it for all along. When Anne slid the letter across the table, William didn't speak. He read it once, then again, and then a third time. Each pass seemed to pull him deeper into the page, as though the words had reached through time and anchored him to something far more personal than royal history. His hands stayed steady, but his jaw tightened, the weight of memory and meaning pressing into him. The room was silent, except for the faint rustle of paper as he folded and unfolded it, unwilling to set it down. Across from him, Catherine sat quietly, her presence calm but unyielding, a steadying force in a moment that threatened to unmoor him completely. She didn't need to read the letter to know what it contained. She could see it written in the way his shoulders sank, in the way his eyes seemed both sharper and more distant. Finally, William looked up, his voice low but edged with something raw. "Do you think she'd be proud?" It was not a question of politics or public image. It was the kind of question only a son could ask, the kind that sought an answer beyond duty. Anne didn't pause, didn't soften her tone. "She already was," she replied, and the certainty in her voice was like a tether pulling him back from the edge. The statement landed with the weight of truth, the kind that couldn't be polished or rehearsed. Anne leaned forward, her gaze locking with his. She told him what she had told Charles, that the crown could give much, but it could take more if left unchecked. She reminded him that his mother had fought not just for herself, but for the freedom of her sons to live beyond the palace script. "Protect your authenticity," she urged. "Protect Catherine's emotional clarity. That's your anchor." The words were deliberate, chosen to plant themselves deep enough to resist the slow erosion of palace expectation. William nodded slightly, but his eyes betrayed the calculations turning over in his mind. He understood the balance of how every gesture, every word would be measured against centuries of tradition. Yet, there was also something else stirring there. Resolve. It wasn't loud or defiant, but it was there, quietly forming. Anne could see it in the way his gaze sharpened when it returned to the folded letter. She knew the signs when someone had been given not just a truth, but a responsibility. Catherine reached for his hand, a silent reinforcement of the bond Diana had once hoped for him to build, not with the institution, but with someone who could stand beside him through it. Her touch was brief, but it carried the kind of unspoken unity that didn't need to be performed for the public. William placed the letter back on the table with care, as though it was both fragile and unshakable all at once. Anne allowed the moment to settle. She didn't press for promises, didn't demand immediate action. She knew change, if it came, would have to come from within him. And as she rose to leave, she understood that this conversation was only the beginning, that the echo of Diana's voice would follow William now in ways even he couldn't yet measure. But there was still one person who needed to know, and Anne wasn't going to wait another 30 years to tell him. Anne didn't call. She didn't arrange a meeting. She simply wrote, "Your mother loved you. I should have said that more." The words came without ceremony, without palace phrasing, without the protective armor of titles. She chose a plain card, her own hand, and the kind of honesty she had denied for years because protocol made truth feel dangerous. There was no apology, because she knew apologies can be bargaining chips in royal conversations. Instead, she offered something harder. She acknowledged the distance she had maintained, the silence she had let stand when a boy needed to hear his mother defended not in newspapers, but in private, in language that did not ask for favors or forgiveness. She told him that Diana's letter had found her, and that it had done what the crown rarely allows. It made her feel accountable. She confessed that she had watched him become a headline more often than a nephew, and that, for too long, she equated duty with restraint, when sometimes duty is speaking plainly, even when the palace would rather you didn't. She wrote that the institution can polish grief into spectacle, but cannot heal the loss it puts on display. She told him the truth about the lines in Diana's handwriting, about the plea that reached across decades, about the fear that the machine would take what it could not replace. She explained that kindness, the very trait Anne once dismissed as volatility, had in fact been Diana's strategy, a deliberate strike against a culture that suffocates tenderness and calls it weakness. She did not ask Harry to return, to reconcile, to pose for photographs. She asked only that he knew his mother's love had not dimmed in the archives or thinned with time, and that someone inside the walls now understood what it had cost her to say it out loud. She signed her name without flourish, resisting the safety of titles, because this was not a royal note. It was a human one. And then she hesitated, not from doubt, but from the gravity of crossing a line the family never admits exists, choosing truth over choreography. Would he answer? She didn't know. That uncertainty felt right. almost necessary. Because this wasn't a negotiation. It was a torch passed quietly, finally, from the woman who had been silenced to the son who had refused to be. Through the aunt who learned too late that silence is not neutral. She sealed the envelope and sat with the stillness that followed, aware that whatever came back, or didn't, would not change what needed to be said. Some letters are not sent to receive replies. They are sent to end a lie. But even as she sealed that envelope, Anne sensed the jewelry box still had one last secret to give. When Princess Anne appeared at a public event wearing Diana's sapphire pin, it wasn't fashion. It was a statement the palace could not control. Word traveled faster than any briefing. The public recognized immediately the modest blue flame Diana had worn during visits where love mattered more than protocol. Suddenly, memory wasn't confined to documentaries or anniversaries. It was pinned to a heartbeat, moving through the crowd without a single word spoken. By evening, timelines were flooded. Timelines became testimonies, and a single hashtag surged past every prediction. Anne remembers. People didn't just share photographs, they shared their own encounters with Diana's bravery, their own stories of feeling seen by a woman who turned attention into shelter. Commentators tried to frame it as a sentimental flourish, but the message was sharper than sentiment. Anne had chosen a symbol tied to Diana's work, not her glamour, and in doing so, she moved the conversation from nostalgia to duty. Inside the palace, that choice carried its own tremor. Camilla felt the weather change the way affection reroutes power, the way a simple pin rewrites a headline, and the rooms that rely on quiet control became restless. There were murmurs about timing, about discretion, about the need to balance the narrative, as if human truth were a press release that could be edited until harmless. Anne did not correct anyone. She didn't need to. The pin was her sentence, and she let it stand. Because the jewelry box had not offered treasure, it had delivered instruction. Diana's letter asked for protection, not performance. Wearing the pin wasn't a nod to the past, it was a promise about the future. In one gesture, Anne argued that legacy is safeguarded by acts, not tablets of stone, and that remembrance without responsibility is only theater. She knew the machine prefers monuments cold, polished, controllable, but a living emblem moves, breathes, interrupts. It reminds everyone that the vow Diana left behind cannot be archived, that kindness is not a pose but a policy, that sons are not roles to be managed but lives to be guarded. The reaction only confirmed it. Veterans remembered the tenderness behind Diana's handshakes. Nurses recalled the warmth in wards where rank had no weight. Young mothers spoke of a courage that made compassion feel like action rather than decor. The pin gathered those voices and carried them back through the very doors that once silenced them. Anne felt the shift, not as triumph, but as alignment, a private promise now visible. She had read the plea. She had confronted the past. She had told the truth to those who most needed to hear it. Now she would live it, with steady steps, with small, unyielding choices that outlast noise. One jewelry box, one plea, one vow she would not disregard. And, as Anne walked away from the cameras, the sapphire catching the last of the day's light, it was clear Diana's voice had finally found its echo. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.